Welcome, everyone, to today's exciting book talk featuring Dr. Josh Milburn, a leading moral and political philosopher specializing in animal ethics, the philosophy of food, and applied ethics. Dr. Milburn is a lecturer in political philosophy at Loughborough University, Loughborough University, and author of Food, Justice, and Animals. He is also the host of the podcast Knowing Animals, which is one of my favorite podcasts on animals, where he interviews academics exploring human-animal relationships. In today's presentation, Dr. Milburn will explore how political philosophy can be applied to animal ethics. Moving beyond traditional moral philosophy, he will challenge the view that animal rights necessitates veganism, proposing alternative methods for food production and considering animals as potential workers with rights. Additionally, he will discuss how animals can be included in just war theory, arguing that their suffering must be considered in decisions about warfare. The talk will cover animal citizenship, food systems, and fittingly for today's National Memorial Day, the ethics of war. My name is Jean. I'm an environmental policy PhD candidate at Wageningen University based in the Netherlands, and I'm thrilled to host this event. After Dr. Milburn's talk, we will have a 20-minute Q&A session where you can submit your questions in the chat or ask him directly if you're comfortable. So please note that while the talk is being recorded and broadcast live on Tencent Video, the Q&A session will not be recorded. So to encourage open and free participation, we invite everyone to share their thoughts and engage in the conversation. Thank you for joining us today. And without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Josh Milburn.
Hello, thank you for having me. I know that lots of you speak English as a second language, and you might be new to philosophy, so I'm going to aim to speak slowly and clearly, and I've got a lot of slides, but some of them we'll just pass over quite quickly. What I'd like to do today is introduce you to my research area of animals and political philosophy and show, as Jim was saying, two of the things I'm trying to do with that. One of which is around food systems, questions about how we should feed our societies from an animal ethics, animal rights perspective, but also questions about war and questions about how we can include animals in the ethics of war. So let me begin with this idea of the political turn in animal ethics. My background is in philosophy. I'm a philosopher, and for many years, since the 1960s, 1970s, lots of philosophers in the English-speaking world have been writing and thinking about animals. Normally, however, they've been thinking about animals in moral philosophy. So many of you may have heard of Peter Singer, Tom Regan, people like that. And what they're doing is they are using the language, the theories, the concepts of moral philosophy and asking the questions of moral philosophy about animals. So, for example, they might think about utilitarianism, the moral theory of utilitarianism, and where animals fit into that. Or they might ask questions about our action as individuals. What, morally speaking, is the best diet for us to have? How, morally speaking, should we relate to our companion animals or pets? Starting around 15 years ago, we started to see philosophers think about animals in the language of political philosophy. So some of you may have come across the book Zoopolis, A Political Theory of Animal Rights by Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka, which was published in 2011 and is available in Chinese as well. Another example is the book Sentientist Politics by Alistair Cochrane. I've worked with both of these authors, Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka at Queen's University in Canada and Alistair Cochrane at Sheffield University in the United Kingdom. Another famous example of this is Martha Nussbaum's work, including Justice for Animals, which again is available in Chinese. So there are there is the start of the translation process into Chinese, which I think is really wonderful. And I think it's also worth saying that we in the English-speaking world often aren't fully aware of what's going on in China. And it's really fantastic to learn that there is this network of people working on animal studies and animal rights in China, in Chinese. And I think there's a lot of people in the English-speaking world who'd be really keen to connect. We're always looking for international collaborators. We're always welcoming students and visitors from other countries. And so I think it's really fantastic that this is going on here. And it's really nice to talk to you today. So what is the political turn in animal ethics? Basically, it's about taking existing political theories in political philosophy, or ideas or concepts in political philosophy, and asking whether they apply to human-animal relationships. So in Zoopolis, Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicker talk about the idea of citizenship for animals. And this is an idea that wasn't discussed in moral philosophy in animals, because citizenship is seen as very much a political idea. It's an idea about our political relationships within our states and our societies. And citizenship carries with it a range of rights and responsibilities. If animals can be citizens, then they get those rights and responsibilities as well. And that might include the right to political participation, the right to have their voices heard in political decision-making processes, whether that's voting or whether that's other forms of communication or deliberation or decision-making. But they also potentially get the responsibilities of citizenship. They have to respect those around them. They have to learn to live with others. And so it's not a one-way thing of animals get these rights, they also get these responsibilities. Alistair Cochrane, whose Sentientist Politics is on the screen, he has a different view. He doesn't support existing state structures, existing borders. He supports a cosmopolitan vision of human-animal relationships, the abolition of borders, and the creation of overlapping communities. So there's lots of different things that we could do, lots of different questions that we could ask, and one of the really interesting things from my perspective about working in this area is that we have a long tradition of political philosophy, but animals have almost never been included. So there's lots of work left to be done. So I know that one person asked about Iris Marion Young's work, and whether that could include animals. And actually, one of the first paper presentations I ever did at a conference was about exactly that. It was about Iris Marion Young's account of the 5 faces of oppression, and the question, are animals oppressed, using the ideas of Iris Marion Young? Or a project I'm doing at the moment, a book I'm working on at the moment, is about the American political philosopher Robert Nozick, who defends a libertarian vision of justice. And he was a vegetarian. He thought a lot about animals, but normally we think of libertarianism, which is a small state political theory, very small state, a kind of right-wing political theory. We think of libertarianism as not friendly towards animals. I think Robert Nozick actually pushes back against that and offers a animal-friendly libertarian vision, or at least that's what I'm arguing in one of my books at the moment. So the political turn in animal ethics, in a sentence, is about doing political philosophy with animals, and it's a really exciting place to be because there's so much work left to be done. What I'm going to do for the rest of this presentation is introduce you to 2 of my big projects that I'm thinking about in the political turn in animal ethics. These projects are separate, but they're similar in the sense that they both extend existing ideas in political theory and existing problems in political theory to include animals. The first of these is about food systems, and the second of these is about warfare. Okay, so first, let me introduce you to questions about food. And this presentation, this part of the presentation, is a very quick summary of my 2023 book, Food, Justice and Animals, Feeding the World Respectfully, which was published by Oxford University Press. Not available in Chinese, sadly, only in English. I start the book with a puzzle. I say, if animals have rights, and I think that animals do have rights, and if those rights are a matter of justice, they're rights that should be protected by the state, which is what I say given that I'm coming from this political turn perspective. This is not just a moral matter, this is a political matter, a matter of justice. Surely, it seems we should have a plant-based food system. That's the obvious answer. But actually, I think that there are principled reasons to support the possibility of a non-plant-based food system, even on animal rights grounds. When I say principled reasons, what I mean is I'm doing what's called, in political philosophy, ideal theory. I'm trying to imagine what a future society which has just correlations between humans and animals looks like. So this isn't necessarily a story saying, here's what we should do today. It's, here's the society we should aim for. So, first of all, we might have concerns from liberal political theory about the possibility of a plant-based food system. Liberals, as many people will know, respect the idea or endorse the idea that people have different ideas about what it means to live a good life. For some people, having access to animal-based food will be part of their conception of the good life. Perhaps it's important for certain relationships they have with other people. It might be important for certain cultural practices. Here in the UK, we are just around the corner from Christmas, and Christmas dinner is an important cultural practice for many British people. And of course, Christmas dinner includes turkey. But we could also think about the work that people have with animals, or their visions of the landscape. So this picture here is from the area called Cumbria in the United Kingdom, which is where I grew up, a rural environment, a countryside environment, an environment that's been shaped by many, many years of animal farming. And so people's vision of what it means to live in this place, a vision of what it means to live in the countryside in the United Kingdom, is very much linked to questions about animal farming. Now, what I'm not saying, because I believe in animal rights, I'm not saying because some people like the taste of meat or like working with animals, we can ignore animal rights. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is the fact that some people value these things, the fact that this is part of their understanding of what it means to live a good life, means that we lose something if we lose these industries. This is a bad thing in at least a small sense. There's other things, but I'll not mention them. We can also recognise that there are concerns from animal rights theory about a plant-based food system. And that's a surprising claim. Why would animal rights theory be worried about a plant-based food system? Well, the first thing to say is that there's been some very interesting work recently in an area that's been called new omnivorism. And new omnivores are people who are worried about the fact that arable agriculture, plant-based agriculture, kills animals. And they suggest that there might be some ways of producing animal-based foods which are actually less harmful to animals than the ways in which we produce plant-based food. So when we grow crops, we kill a small number of animals through the use of pesticides or through animals being caught in machinery, things like that. Whereas there might be other ways of producing food that vegans would reject, which nonetheless are less harmful to animals. And then finally, another quick puzzle is that some animal rights-based systems, especially very plant-based systems, seem to be committed to saying that animal rights means the end of relationships with animals. And that is surprising. It's surprising to say, we are rescuing you, we are liberating you to the animals, and then say, but there's no place for you. You are just going to die out. That's a surprising result. So, what is the point of this conversation, the point of these worries that I am raising about a plant-based food system? Well, I think that we have some reasons to be worried about plant-based food systems. And that means we have some reasons to be open to non-plant-based food systems. And that means that we have at least some reasons to support non-plant-based food systems if those non-plant-based food systems can be compatible with animal rights. That's the big challenge. Could we have non-plant-based food systems that are compatible with animal rights? And answering that question is what most of my book does. So now I'm just going to quickly introduce you to some of the answers that I offer in the book. So the first example of a non-plant-based food production method which might be compatible with animal rights is the use of invertebrates, or some invertebrates. Lots of animal rights theorists, myself included, think that there's something special about sentience. Someone like Peter Singer would say that sentience is the capacity to feel pain. I think that's slightly too simple a version of sentience. Roughly, sentience is the ability to experience the world, and to experience the world in ways that are good or bad. So not only does a sentient being have a perspective, but they care. They can feel things that are good for them, feel things that are bad for them. And that might include pain and pleasure. So if there's something special about sentience, it's those animals who are sentient who have rights. And that means that those animals who are probably sentient, they get rights. And those animals who are not sentient, they don't get rights. So the picture here shows sacks full of cockles. Cockles are bivalves. Oysters would be another example. Open closed shells on the beach. There might be lots of other examples. Okay, jellyfish is an example I use sometimes when I'm talking about this. Jellyfish are not widely eaten in Europe, but I know they are eaten in Chinese, Japanese, Korean cuisine. And so I think sometimes I use that example, and that's a good example. Jellyfish don't seem to be, they don't have brains, they don't have nervous systems. There's no reason for us to think that they're sentient, so no reason to think that they have rights. So even though they are animals, I suggest there's nothing wrong with eating them. We could also talk about the prospect of plant-based meat. This phrase some people think is a contradiction. There's no such thing as plant-based meat. And that is an interesting metaphysical question about what makes something meat. However, I think that plant-based meat is the sort of thing that can replicate meat. It can be very similar to meat. In blind taste tests, some people can't tell the difference between plant-based meat and meat from the dead body of an animal. And this is something that could be compatible with animal rights. Now, there have been challenges to plant-based meat. Okay, there might be something disrespectful about replicating meat, or it might be bad food for some reason. And I spend a lot of time in the book addressing those questions, pushing back against those challenges. A more sophisticated technological answer to the question comes from cultivated meat. Cultivated meat is meat grown outside of an animal's body. Starting with a few animal cells, food technologists can create something that is materially the same as animal meat, but has never been inside an animal's body. We can do something quite similar when it comes to milk and eggs. And this is done using a technology called precision fermentation. What happens here is scientists take yeast, for example, and then genetically modify it to create proteins. So, for example, we can use the genetic material of cows to modify yeast to produce milk proteins. And this means that we can produce milk that has never been inside the body of a cow. One of the very puzzling things about cultivated meat from the perspective of animal rights is that at the moment the technology still requires the input of animals. It still requires animal cells as a starting point. If you like a comparison, the animal cells are like seeds that we plant and they grow then into meat. But we still need those seeds. So where are the animals? Well, some people support something called the pig in the backyard model. Their idea is that pigs could live with us in our back gardens or in our communities, and we could take a few cells from these pigs and use those cells to grow into meat. This is a very utopian vision of how humans and animals could live together. An alternative would be a vision that I call mail order cells, and this is the sort of thing that lots of food technologists like. They don't worry about the animals. They want the animals to be well away from them. They just want to get the cells so that they can then produce the food. I've suggested that one way we could develop these ideas, again, this is borrowing from liberal political theory, so perhaps in other traditions of political theory this would work slightly differently. We could imagine something like animal workers. And if animals are workers, working on farms to produce cells that can then go into this process, they deserve the rights of workers. What kind of animal worker rights am I imagining? Well, this is quite speculative. What I don't want to do is say, well, animals are workers, so it's okay for us to raise them on farms and kill them. My view is still an animal rights view. But I think that we can do interesting things with animal rights when we start to think about the categories to which these animals belong. Like Donaldson and Kimlicka thinking about animals as citizens, I'm taking ideas of workers and applying them to animals. So, for example, maybe animals who are workers would have a right to a union to represent their interests in the workplace. They might have rights to be paid. What does that mean for animals? That's a difficult question. They will have a right to a healthy, hygienic and safe working environment. So of course, this is not going to be a factory farm, which is not a healthy, safe place for animals. Of course, this is not going to be a slaughterhouse, which is not a healthy, safe place for animals. They might get they might get a right to time off, and they might get a right to retirement. What we can't do is have animal workers and then just kill them when we're done with them. And they might have a right to a choice over the kind of work that they do. And once we have this idea of animal workers in the cultivated meat space, we might be able to extend it to other cases. Could we imagine, for example, something like an egg farm where chickens or ducks or other birds are protected with workers' rights and yet nonetheless produce eggs? They couldn't produce cheap eggs because these rights would be expensive to enforce, to ensure that these animals were properly respected. to ensure they could retire, to ensure they could have time off, to ensure they were paid. But I think for lots of people, they would be willing to pay that price to have the eggs that they value. And that, I think, could be a wonderful way to recognise the importance of these foods in people's lives, while also recognising the importance of the rights of animals. There's the cover of my book. So my proposal is that we should explore non-vegan food systems. And if those non-vegan food systems could be compatible with animal rights, they should be permitted. And if those food systems can actually overcome the problems with a plant-based food system that I identified, they should be endorsed. And so, for example, we could talk about non-sentient animals, plant-based and cultivated alternatives to animal products, and the products of genuine animal workers respected with genuine animal rights. These are the sorts of things I endorse, but there might be other ideas we can explore as well. But as a final thought on this part, I want to reiterate that this is a proposal in ideal theory. And what that means is that this is a vision of the direction we might want to go. It's not necessarily a vision about how we should behave today. And I am a vegan. I do support veganism, and I do think that we should champion veganism. I just think that it's possible that we can respect animal rights and have a non-vegan future with care. This isn't easy, but it's a direction we may want to go. So, that's my first research area I wanted to talk to you about. But when we were planning this session, there was lots of questions about both the food side and this other research area of mine. So I thought, well, why not talk to you about both? And this second area are questions about animals and the ethics of war. And I note that a lot of this work has been done with my colleague Sarah van Goosen, who is based at the University of York here in the United Kingdom. She's originally from the Netherlands, so another Dutch connection there. So, when we started this project, it was around the same time as the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And this was all over the news in the United Kingdom. And one of the very interesting things about this was that we saw many, many pictures of Ukrainians fleeing Ukraine with their animals. And this is not something that we often see in war zones. Often animals are left behind. Whereas these people were bringing their animals with them. So here's a picture of a woman fleeing with her dog. Here's a picture, this is just over the border in Poland, and this is a picture of some activists who went into the war zone and brought animals back out. So these are animals who were left behind and then subsequently rescued by animal activists. This is a picture of a stand at a refugee area in Poland with a very large number of gifts, food, toys, leads for animals, beds, towels. People were ready to help these animals and these people who were fleeing with their animals. These donations had come from Germany. And I think this is a wonderful picture of a young boy who has fled the war zone and brought, I think it's a gerbil or a hamster, but brought a very tiny animal with him because he couldn't leave this animal behind. So we thought that there was an interesting gap in the literature, in that questions about animal rights were very familiar to philosophers, and questions about the ethics of war were very familiar to philosophers, but actually not many people thought about the two at the same time. So we have the separation between these literatures. And that to us was very surprising, because there are all kinds of important ways that we could think about animals in the ethics of war, or think about war from an animal ethics perspective. So our project now, and we've been doing this for a few years, is to try and bring these literatures together to address the questions that both of them are interested in. And that encompasses a very wide range of different questions. So what I'm going to do in the last few minutes of this presentation is introduce you to some of those questions. I won't necessarily give you many answers, because what we've realised is that actually this is very difficult. So what we start with is a tradition of philosophy and law and theology. It comes up in lots of areas, called just war theory. And just war theory is concerned, I'll not go into too much detail here, don't worry, but it's concerned with questions about when it's permissible to wage war, that is, when it is okay for states or people to go to war, but also that's called jus ad bellum in Latin, but also questions about how we can behave in war, what we are allowed to do in war. And that's called jus in bello in Latin. And what we have are a series of criteria, a series of rules that we have to follow in both cases. And what we want to argue for is the possibility of what we call an inclusive just war theory, a just war theory that includes animals. And that inclusive just war theory will answer lots of questions. So here are just some of the questions. It will tell us, are we allowed to go to war to help animals? It will tell us, can we have wars against animals? Does that idea even make sense? It will tell us whether we're allowed to harm animals when we are fighting in war. It will tell us whether we can use animals to fight in war. Horses, dogs, etc. It will also answer some quite difficult theoretical questions, such as how an inclusive just war theory should value animals. How important are animals? How should it weigh animal and human lives? And the more fundamental question still of, can just war theory include animals, or do we need to change just war theory in order to include animals? Are there enough ideas in just war theory already to include animals, or do we need to expand it, to change the foundations of the theory in order to include animals? But we then realise that actually just war theory can only answer some of the questions we care about when it comes to animals and war. Just war theory is good at answering some questions, but not others. And at the very end, I'll nod towards some things that we can think about in the ethics of war that are not part of just war theory as we traditionally understand it. So the next few slides I'll do quite quickly, so don't worry too much. I'm just mentioning the questions. So first of all, we could ask the question of whether we could wage war for animals. And this is an incredibly controversial question, because it seems to be a question about whether we can do violence to humans in order to help animals. And that, of course, makes people very upset, understandably. This is a controversial, scary question. And actually, we think that just war theory does not suggest that it's easy to justify war for animals. There are lots of reasons to hold back. And let's be clear, just war theory is not a theory that supports war. War is a terrible thing. Actually, we think our work is showing that war is even more terrible than we originally thought, because we used to think war was terrible when we were thinking only about humans. And now we think about humans and animals. We see war is more terrible still. There's a nice Chinese connection here. The war against pests, the 4 Pests campaign from Chairman Mao. An example, perhaps, of someone declaring war on animals or on certain animals. And so there's been a few people who have tried to explore the question of whether we can wage war against animals. Some of you might have come across Dinesh Waddiwell's work, and I know he's presented to this audience before, and I believe his book is available in Chinese as well. He's doing something a little bit different to what we're doing, because he's trying to imagine whether our current relationship with animals is warlike, whereas we are talking about literal warfare. So there's a methodological difference between what we're doing, but nonetheless, we think his work is very, very interesting. There's also been a number of conversations about wars to protect or military force to protect biodiversity or wild animals. So the people on the picture here are not soldiers, although they are using large guns and they're dressed like soldiers. Instead, they are a Forestry Department Wildlife Protection Unit. I think they're in Vietnam, maybe? Somewhere in East Asia anyways. I can't remember precisely where. And we think that actually some people have been too quick to say that this is a good thing. And we think we're actually quite worried about these tendencies. These can be quite harmful practices because, again, war is not a nice thing. And trying to make conservation more like war is potentially going to do a lot of damage. I'll say a little bit more about this slide. So when we talk about jus in bello, justice in war, what it means to fight a war in a morally acceptable way, we think that we should include animals in these calculations. We should think seriously about the fact that war does harm to animals. When animals are hurt in war, normally, but not always, but normally, when they're hurt, it is incidental. That is, soldiers do not intend to harm animals, they are caught in the crossfire. So when we drop bombs on our enemies in war, we're not normally trying to kill animals. We're trying to kill people, or we're trying to destroy weapons. But animals are killed by accident. And just war theory already has tools for thinking about this kind of accidental or incidental harm. And they are proportionality and necessity. Proportionality says the amount of harm that we cause cannot outweigh the harm that we will avert. Okay? So if a particular attack will save lives, that's a good thing. But you can't kill more people in the attack than you will save, roughly. This is a complicated question. But the idea is you can't do lots and lots of damage, lots and lots of harm, in order to avert a small amount of damage or harm. Necessity is similar, but it says when you've got two options, one of which causes a large amount of harm and one of which causes a small amount of harm, you should choose the option that causes a small amount of harm rather than the one that causes a large amount of harm. And so what we think, what we argue, is that we should include harm to animals in these calculations. So right now, when people calculate whether the harm they're causing is proportionate or is necessary, they're thinking about harm to humans, especially human civilians. But we think they should also include harm to animals. And of course, this means that it becomes harder to justify war because animals are harmed in war in all kinds of ways. So now it's not just the human harm that they need to take into account, but the animal harm as well. The overall harm of war is therefore much higher, and therefore war becomes harder to justify. We don't think it becomes impossible to justify, but we do think it becomes harder to justify. This is an elephant who has trodden on a landmine. and so has been badly injured by that. We can also ask about the use of animals in war. This picture here shows a training exercise for a military dog. Actually, this is a very complicated set of questions. One thing I will note, and this is what I put in number 4 in my possibilities here, is that we could think about animals as social members, using the same kinds of ideas I've just talked about as animal workers, maybe. Maybe animals should be included as workers or as soldiers, and then get the rights and protection of workers and soldiers. But this is a very complicated area, because actually the ways in which animals are used in war are very varied. There are lots of different kinds of animals used in war in different kinds of ways. So trying to come up with ethical principles that apply to all of them is very difficult. Okay, and just as a few closing thoughts, things get a little bit more complicated now, because here are some puzzles that we think are very important puzzles, but which just war theory is not very good at dealing with. So we need to think about other principles, other theories, other ideas in the ethics of war than just war theory. So, I'll not mention that one. We could think seriously about remembering animals. And so this picture on the top right is from the Animals in War Memorial in London, which was opened, I think, 20 years ago. And so when we think about past military exercises, one of the important things we consider is our duty to remember, or the importance of remembering what has happened and remembering the sacrifices made. And so we can ask similar kinds of questions about the animals killed in war. And on the top left, you can see those red poppies. People who have been to the UK might have encountered this before. Around Remembrance Day in November, we wear sometimes a red poppy to symbolise our remembrance of soldiers who've died in war. Some people wear a purple poppy, and the purple poppy, like on the picture, symbolises remembrance of those animals killed in war. Well, let me just... yeah. The thought I'll finish on is this one. If we are serious about trying to create a military that is more respectful to animals, the most important thing we can do in many ways is actually quite boring. It's quite simple, it's quite obvious. It's to ask questions about the relatively routine use of animals in war. So, for example, soldiers eat a lot of animal products. They eat a lot of meat. Soldiers wear a lot of leather, a lot of wool, and so on. Anyone who's been to London might have seen our house guards who wear the red outfits and wear those very large hats, the very large fluffy hats. It's kind of a tourist attraction. They're soldiers, but the hats they wear are made of bear skin. And so the UK military kills a lot of bears to create these hats. And this periodically creates controversy in the newspapers in the UK, because people really don't like the fact that we're killing bears for these hats. Animals are also used in the development and training, the development of weapons and medicines, and the training of medics. Finally, we could ask whether animals might be refugees. So, just a closing thought on warfare. We think, Sarah Van Goosen and I, think that it's time for us to bring together these different questions of animal ethics, questions of warfare, questions about animals as refugees, questions about animals as soldiers, and so on and so on and so on, and try to come up with a systematic theory of just war theory that takes animals seriously. War is hell. That's a famous line, a famous quote. War is hell. But even in hell, we think things can be better or worse for animals. And we think that taking animals seriously in questions about the ethics of war represents a genuine chance to make the world a little less awful, both for animals and for humans. But as we've realised, there's a lot of work to do here. And we hope we inspire some other people to think about these questions as well, because there's far too much work for just the two of us. This requires a lot of research, a lot of development, a lot of thought. And hopefully, if people can give that thought, can spend that time, we can make the world a genuinely better place. And so to finish, there's some purple poppies in remembrance of animals killed in past wars. And that's me. Thanks so much for listening. I really hope that was interesting, and I really look forward to hearing what you've got to say.